In 1770, after sailing upon the eastern coast of Australia for a few months, Captain Cook landed upon Possession Island, one of the islands in the Torres Strait Island group, and claimed the entire area that he had set his eyes upon for the British Empire. It was a convenient colonial grab, and following the loss of Britain's North American colonies in the Revolutionary War, they began exporting their prisoners to the new continent in 1788, and Australia's colonialization began. Now, of course, that's the British story. That land was only readily available if you disregard all of the Torres Strait Islander and Aboriginal peoples that were already living there. This was pretty easy for Great Britain to do. They claimed terra nullius, the Latin term meaning land belonging to no one. Yes, there were technically human beings living on the land, but none fit in the British definition of civilized society, so it was as if there were no actual people there. This painting, commissioned by the Crown, doesn't even paint the indigenous people into the scene. It's literally as if they weren't there, even though they were custodians of the land for thousands of years. It was only in 1992 when this doctrine was overturned in the highly consequential Mabo decision, which recognized the Meriam people's ownership of Mare Island, only after 10 years of legal advocacy by Eddie Koiki Mabo. I'm here at the Tate Modern Museum in London, which is currently hosting the exhibition A Year in Art Australia in 1992, displaying Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art from before and after the landmark ruling. We're going to look closer at one piece in particular, Possession Island, Abstraction, by Gordon Bennet, created just a year before the Mabo decision. Bennet himself was of Anglo-Celtic and Aboriginal descent, the latter of which was hidden from him until his later teenage years. A lot of his work grapples with identity and the narratives of Australia's colonial past that he had been taught and what they were missing. This piece in particular references a common historical image of Captain Cook and his crew arriving on Possession Island. It depicts the triumphant arrival of the British fleet as they began to set up camp upon the land, with the sole indigenous person welcoming them in servitude, carrying a tray of drinks. These are the images that are proliferated in history courses. This was the narrative that Bennet grew up being taught. Now, intertextuality is key to Bennet's style. First and foremost, he takes this historical image, itself representative of the dominant and incomplete narrative of the country's foundation, and he twists it a bit to recontextualize the story. It's critical that he modified this existing image rather than creating an entirely new one, as his intent is not just to legitimize Aboriginal histories, it also needs to delegitimize the existing hegemony. Now we see that the body of the sole Aboriginal man in the frame is abstracted away behind rectangles colored in the hues of the Aboriginal flag. His personhood is reduced to a symbol. We can no longer observe him as a person, and yet this now makes him the central visual element of the painting, so we look at him, or more accurately, the idea of him, even more that he is noticeably gone. Furthermore, the colored blocks are also a reference to the abstract art of Kazimir Malevich, who pioneered the movement suprematism, where plain colored squares would allow an escape from the confines of the reality of the world and its context. It's a motif Bennet uses frequently, as he questions whether it's possible to erase context from art when your culture is not aligned with the dominant narrative. In this case, we can see how cultural identity consumes the subject of the painting entirely. Now, looking beyond the rectangles, we also see some footprints leading up to the abstracted man. It's another subtle little stab at the terra nullius narrative. Though his identity is merely symbolic, he still left a mark on the land. This mark was impermanent, though, not the guns and fanfare that accompanied the British. Indeed, this was more in line with the custodial relationship that Aboriginal people have with the land, opposed to the attitudes of dominance and exploitation that the colonizers held. Let's continue on the notion of impermanence. Looking closer, we can see that the painting is made up of a bunch of dots. This is typical of contemporary Aboriginal paintings, which have only been in existence for the past 50 or so years. You see, Aboriginal people don't use a written language. Their stories are told through symbols, in song, dance, and drawings in the sand. These stories, which have been passed down for thousands of years, tell of the dream time, or when the world was created, and they are highly protected. When non-Indigenous people suggested that the Aboriginal people record their drawings on more permanent canvases, there was a fear that the sacred symbols would be revealed to those who don't have permission to see them. The solution was to obscure these parts of the painting with the characteristic dots, which played a role in the general style drawn in the sand to begin with. By including these dots in this originally Western painting, Bennet hits at something abstracted within that original story, namely the Indigenous perspective. He references the ways in which the ethnocentrism at the heart of colonialism precludes Westerners from understanding the nuances of the Torres Strait Islander and Aboriginal societies. Even when people finally came around to noticing the aesthetic beauty of the culture, they were still deliberately uninvited from understanding its full complexity. Bennet utilizes intertextuality beautifully by taking the familiar imagery of the dominant narratives and infusing it with Aboriginal styles, symbols, and imprints. It reclaims the portion of the story and his own identity that belongs to the indigenous peoples of Australia.